Hello and welcome to this JCPA special interview with Professor Leslie Pal. My name is Thanasis Kouglas and I am the media coordinator for the journal. I have been the media coordinator since 2014. Welcome, Leslie. Good to have you with us. So Leslie, you've been the journal's executive director for almost 6 years. You served 2 terms in this position. You have previously served as JCPA Special Issues Editor as well, if I remember correctly, you can correct me. And in general, you have been a very important and special person for JCPA and for the advancement of comparative policy analysis in general. And as we all know, you're leaving us. This is your last week in this position, and I would like to take this opportunity on behalf of the whole team and celebrate your contribution to the journal and the ICPA forum with this special interview. And as you are one of these persons who is also a bit of the institutional memory of this journal and this field, I would like you to take a look back and think and reflect a bit on what has been achieved in this last 6 or more years.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and thank you for the kind words. Actually, I've served as special issues editor and executive editor simultaneously. So I had 2 editorial roles with the journal, and these 2 positions will now be taken up by 2 different people. So I think that in itself will be a great benefit, because 2 people are better than 1, especially with both of these activities. And that's one measure, actually, or one change that's occurred over the last 6 years under my tenure. Not that it had necessarily anything to do with me, but the number of submissions that have come in, the number of special issues that we've had have all increased. And so there's much more activity in the field generally, but I think because of the stature of the journal, it's attracted a lot more attention and a lot more submissions. So I was able to kind of manage and ride those 2 horses simultaneously for the 6 years, but it's going to be good to have them separated and taken on by two different people.
Okay, thanks, and thanks for clarifying this.
Yeah. No, it's not a problem. Some of the accomplishments, the impact factor jumped. I don't ascribe that to my role, but we did try to create a much more professional and a high standard journal, and I think that attracted better articles, and people were reading it, and we had a couple of very senior and leading members of the field contribute articles, and some of our special issues got a lot of attention, on methods in particular. So the impact factor went up. We're now at 1.4 something, I think, and there was a big jump in about 2017. So that was a benefit. We've gone now to more issues. So we're publishing 6 issues a year rather than the 4 + 1, which would have been 4 regular issues and 1 special issue. So that's been a change. The website for the journal and for ICPA was something that we worked on in the very early days when I came on board. And that's been a way of reaching out to the wider community. Your role, I think you probably sort of came on board just around the same time as I did, and with that position, that's been a major benefit. So, I think, the journal was building and growing and improving over the years, but in the last 5 or 6 years, we, Iris as a founding editor and chief editor, worked hard to extend the community, raise the standards, make the journal more visible, and all of that, I think, made good contributions to the field.
Mm-hmm. What do you think have been and will be the most important challenges that the journal has faced and will be facing in the future?
That's a big question. Some of the challenges.
Engaging reviewers, for instance.
That is one issue. It is a challenge for every journal, is finding the right reviewers for articles, and that means the right reviewers in a couple of senses, that they're experts in their field, and you're not just finding people randomly that happen to do comparative policy, but they don't know about health policy or education. but the right reviewers also in the sense that they can respond quickly and thoroughly and professionally. Everybody's busy, and I understand that, but sometimes people will accept, I think, out of goodwill, and then life intervenes, or they have other professional commitments, and it becomes difficult for them to get their comments in on time. So from a purely operational point of view, and any editors out there who are listening to this, I'm sure will appreciate it. From a purely operational point of view, that's probably the daily challenge, is just getting good reviewers coming in on time and turning around the manuscripts reasonably quickly. And I think we've been working really hard to develop an internal system. I won't bore people with the mechanics of that, the plumbing, but we've been working on the internal behind the scenes mechanisms to try to ensure that we do have a much more rapid response. We get reviewers on board, we get the reviews in, and we're able to get a decision out. So that's kind of an internal, operational, immediate issue that every journal faces. The long-term, more medium-term challenges, the nature of, well, you want to go meta, we can go stratospheric on this one. The nature of academic publishing and the incentive and reward system within this profession, I think, obviously has implications and impacts on journals as well as digital media and how people get their research product out there. People are doing, the metrification of scholarship means that everybody's being measured every which way, up and down, every second, and reporting constantly on everything that they're doing. Everybody can appreciate this. And of course, the old pressure on, publish or perish has been ratcheted up, I think, quite considerably. It's my impression. I'm not a young scholar anymore, but my sense from my colleagues is, and of course now I'm part of the apparatus of assessment and metrification as a dean in my college here. So I'm at the other end of it. I'm the one cracking the whip, and I can see that this kind of pressure for putting everybody under the microscope and assessing everything that they do. So that creates increased pressures on everybody to publish, and all of that is good, but it means that we're getting a lot of, that's increased, I think, the flow of publications. So that's one kind of issue. And then, so then if there's much more supply, but relatively few channels to absorb that supply, you get the multiplication of journals, you get more competition among journals, and people also want to get their stuff out more quickly, and they want, and the journal publication cycle, even with, rapid publication online and digital publishing before the actual physical copy of the journal comes out, even with that, people still are looking for different avenues. So, again, among conversations with other editors, this issue comes up, is the long-term fortunes of paper-based journals like our own, and the more staid academic or publishing cycle that we used to have. So I think that's a big issue. And the other one, and I'll stop, but I could go on forever, but open access and making sure that publicly funded research is publicly available. And and there's increasing pressures by granting agencies to ensure that, and also by universities, that their research products are open access. And how we pay for that and how we square that with a model, the traditional model of journal publishing, is an open question. But it's beginning to happen, but we're still exploring that.
Can you give us a bit of an indication of the size of the journal? How much has it grown in quantity and articles and issues through the years? I have the sense that we have increased quite significantly since.
Well, it's 22 years now of publication. So that in itself is an accumulation of layer upon layer upon layer. That's another challenge, is the accumulation of knowledge. You don't just want these archaeological layers that don't have any connection to each other. So that's one indicator. It started, I think, 22 years ago as 4 issues per year. So we've just recently moved to the 6 issues. The special issues, I'm not sure Iris would know when those were introduced. And that gave us a bit more capacity in terms of being able to, we haven't been that directive with special issues. We've been more responsive. So it's been up to the community to propose special issues. and then that gets reviewed and assessed and then goes through the usual
Mhm.
reviewing process. But I think that's been increased. And of course, with COVID, just as a little plug here, we're going to have two special issues, coming out, I think almost simultaneously on COVID. There was just so much interest and so much scholarly productivity, even
Yeah.
on the fly, around that issue. So around that question. So there's both the accumulation of articles and materials and all of the ancillary activities that are associated with that. People should remember that if it's a special issue, that's only 5 or 6 papers per issue. But special issues usually spring from a workshop or some kind of panel or series of panels. So the ancillary activities around a special issue could involve as many as a dozen papers, not all of which were able to get into the special issue. So I think, and I'm kind of proud of that, is that for every issue that, special issue in particular, that we've published, that's been a catalyst for activity and workshops and exchanges and interchange within the scholarly community that's much wider than just the handful of articles that published in that particular issue.
You mentioned that the journal has been around for about 22 years, and indeed we celebrated the 20th year anniversary a few years ago with their publication of the classics, with a special issue, with articles. Now, what do you think? This is a journal that was initially conceived to promote comparative policy analysis. What would you say has been achieved with respect to the rejuvenation of this field of study?
Mm-hmm. Well, we had several articles in that special issue that you're referring to, and I recommend people go to them, that looked at the evolution of the field through things like bibliometrics and looking at articles. And Iris herself published a piece that did some of that. So, I mean, some of the key conclusions were that comparative public policy, really clearly, in terms of the kinds of publications and articles that came out over that 20-year period, dramatically increased in number. So the visibility of the field increased. And I think it's fair to say this was partly a result or a contribution of the journal itself. And again, you can't just think of it as a single journal or 4 issues a year. If you think of it that way, you think, well, how could this have an effect on a wider field?
Yeah.
But for every issue, for every article, for every special issue, there's a conference meeting, there's an editorial meeting, there's an editorial board, there's liaisons with different professional academic associations. So, don't be fooled. One journal think of it as a force field of magnetic attraction to activities that are ancillary, but galvanized as a result of the creation of that single journal. So that single journal is an epicenter of scholarly activity. And I think in that respect, it's not so implausible to think that it could have had this kind of shock effect, in stimulating a body of research and a body of activity more widely. But all that said, even outside of the journal's activities, comparative public policy did begin to increase and almost took over comparative politics, even though there was a relationship between the two. So that was one important area of evolution within the field. I think the theory, we have made some singular contributions, I think, in terms of theory discussions and debates around theory, multiple streams. We had a special issue on that, for example. Innovative theoretical frameworks, the application of frameworks. We had issues and articles on fiscal austerity in the post-2008 fiscal financial crisis. And also, the comparative method, which 20 years ago was there. I mean, as a graduate student, when I was doing my PhD, the comparative method was, and works and thinking about comparative methodology, I mean, you can trace it back to John Stuart Mill, of course, but the modern kind of deeper thinking about comparative policy and comparative politics is really bubbling up in the 60s and 70s. So it was still a relatively new field. And I think the journal has made some singular contributions to encouraging some deep thinking on comparative methodology and methods and how we think about case studies and different approaches to doing comparative research.
And allow me to be a bit more provocative now. Why do we need comparative policy analysis?
Well, let's back up. I don't think it's a need. It's an inevitable component of thinking. So we do comparative politics or comparative policy or comparative analysis all the time, whether we know it or not. It's like speaking prose. We do it because in any assessment of any single phenomenon, it's always against the backdrop or a context of some sort, even if it's subconscious. You're always assessing. I'm looking at a chair right now. I know it's a chair because I'm automatically assessing it against the table that is next to it. And I know that the chair is not the table and the table is not the chair. So comparative analysis is just hardwired into our brains and our way of thinking. So it's not a need, it's a disposition. It's an inevitable aspect of human cognition. Why do we need it in a more narrow sense? We need it because we need to learn, and we need to be able to test our theories. So from a practitioner's perspective, you can only learn if you can get outside of your own context, because what may work or not work will be dependent on understanding what the specifics are of the situation in which you're embedded. And you can only do that by stepping out of it. And one way to step out is to think about comparison. So if something in Brazil is not working, you may not know why or why not it's working, because you only understand the Brazilian context. But stepping out and examining how the same thing is working or not working in Germany or in Denmark or in Qatar will give you a sense, or begin to give you a sense of what the answers are. And from a theoretical perspective, again, you're as familiar as I am, and our audience will be too. You can only test your theories, I think, against comparative data to more robustly.
Now, you mentioned the practitioners, and practitioners, they make comparisons themselves, but they usually don't make systematic comparisons. They try to learn from different settings. What do they have to learn from systematic comparative analysis? And actually, do they actually listen to policy scientists who conduct comparative analysis?
They listen selectively, and that's a problem. I think one of our challenges as academics is to build better bridges into policy advisory systems within governments. And I've been part of different mechanisms and ways of doing that through training or workshops or executive training or government academies and training academies, exchanges. So I think the practitioners can learn more. Well, how to put this? There are these two worlds, and they have their own specificities, and it's perfectly understandable that they do. But there should be better bridges between them, I think, or among them. And if that can be done, that would be helpful to practitioners, because it should provide, and we have to be careful about what we can offer. We can't overpromise, but I think things like better comparative data, innovative ways of thinking about things, and I think this is underappreciated. It's not just a matter of providing decision makers with reams and reams of data. It's often an arresting idea, a way of framing things, a reframing of a problem or an issue, and understanding it in different terms that can be really helpful to the policy process. So I think that's one of the contributions, among the contributions that academics can make to practitioners, is not just the data and the research, which is helpful and often not on the radar of whoever the internal advisory apparatus might be, but also just fresher, out of the box kind of ways of thinking about issues. Not all academics are equipped to do that, and it sometimes is a matter of serendipity. But if it happens, it can work quite well. And anybody watching this will know, there have been cases of arresting insights, whether we agree with them or not, that have made a difference in the way an entire generation of policymakers might think about policy issues. One example, when Robert Putnam wrote Bowling Alone, I mean, that reframed the way people thought about social capital, and it cascaded down and changed the way people thought about social policy.
Yeah.
So we can't all be Robert Putnams, but you know, to the degree that we can make a contribution.
And are there any steps that practitioners can possibly take to reach out to the community in a more efficient way, to academia?
I was thinking about that. Yeah, I think one way, and it's really low-hanging fruit, and it is practiced in different ways by different governments, is having some kind of circulation of practitioners into academia and back. So executive exchange programs is one example of that, but running both ways, so that academics can come into the advisory process and serve for a year, or, you know, on secondment. And they can learn as well, and they can take back the hard lessons of actually making policy. I mean, there's nothing worse than an academic who's just finished their PhD, moved directly into academia, spent 10 years teaching undergraduate students about the policy cycle, and thinks that that's the way the policy is actually made, and gives this as kind of gospel to his or her students. And if, you know, 20 minutes in a cabinet office is going to tell you that the policy cycle doesn't capture what actually goes on. Yeah. And going back to my point about insights that are generated, I think in my own experiences at my previous school at Carleton, when we had executive exchanges and politicians and practitioners coming in, it's like they had a moment or a month or 6 months to breathe, because their lives are under intense pressure and daily demands on a 24/7 basis at the senior levels of decision making. They cannot breathe, they cannot think, they cannot read, they cannot reflect. And so giving them that space and exposing them to a seminar or a discussion, it's not going to be a direct transfer of knowledge. They're not going to take theory X from Professor Y and carry it back and apply it, but they may come away with a reading list or a book or an insight, and down the road that can make a change.
Yeah. I'd like to now get back to you, the discussion to you, Leslie Pal, the professor. Where are you now? What are you doing? I know you're the founding dean of the College of Public Policy at the Hamad bin Khalifa University, if I pronounce it correctly.
Yes, quite good.
So big new project for you, yes?
Yes, it's an honor. The Hamad bin Khalifa University this is named after Sheikh Hamad, who was the father emir, the previous emir. The current emir is Emir Tamim, and the Al Thani family. Hamad bin Khalifa University is 10 years old. It's part of Qatar Foundation and Education City here in Doha. I've been coming back and forth for about 12 years, and at HBKU, Hamad bin Khalifa University, they've been teaching policy in a variety of different formats, and I was contributing to that, doing some policy teaching, and worked on a couple of book projects here as well. But 2 years ago, the university decided to set up a separate standalone College of Public Policy, and I was fortunate enough to be offered the position of founding dean. So for the last 18 months now, I've been working here to establish a College of Public Policy. We have an MPP that we think is, you know, at the best international standards of MPPs that one would find in Europe and North America. And we're building the research program and activities around that.
So it's a graduate school, yeah?
It's only a graduate school.
It's only a graduate school.
Program,
how big is the school at the moment?
At the moment, we have 30 students. So again, it's been 18 months. So the second cohort came in September, and we've so far recruited 6 faculty members. Okay, great. And you have an international body of students attending, or is it mostly local, or? About 50-50. So, and one careful point, if they're local, sometimes they're residents. The country has got about 2.7 million in population, but there's only about 400,000 native Qataris. So the largest portion of the population is expats. So if we have residents, some of those are actually from, they're non-Qataris, they're from other countries. Yeah, so we have some Central Asian students, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, we have Nigerians, we have Oman, Omani students, Turkish students. So we've got a mix, an interesting mix, and as well as the Qatari nationals that are here as well.
Great. I'd like to wish you good luck with this, and I hope we can actually cooperate on this level in the future.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yes. I'd like to ask you now, you've had a big career as an academic. You've been a prolific author of books, articles. What is it that you're working on at the moment?
It's a project that has been underway for the last 3 years on global policy advisory systems. I know your own work is on policy advice I think within the domestic level or at the domestic level within the usual areas of cabinet advice or cabinet machinery. My interest over the years has grown to looking at global policy systems. And I did a book on the OECD in 2012. And looking at how an international organization like the OECD contributed to global conversations around public sector reform. I mean, it was just interesting in those days to realize, the Canadians, the Americans, the Belgians, the Germans, the Australians, they were all talking about the same sorts of issues. Why was that purely coincidental, or was there something that cut across all those different regimes? And organizations like the OECD do that. So, and there are, of course, other examples of global policy issues like the pandemic that require global policy responses. So I've become interested in that global level of policymaking. And if policy is made at the global level, then just as is true at the domestic level, you would need policy advice of some sort. So my interest is in how policy advice gets channeled and directed in very different ways from the domestic arena at the global level, and how that connects to domestic policy making and cycles back up through but the most recent, I've discovered a species. It's like a horticulturalist in the jungle discovering a new caterpillar. I've discovered, I think, a new species of global policy summits that is actually more prevalent than I think people typically presume. The exemplar of this is Davos, the World Economic Forum, where rock stars, politicians, big thinkers, academics, consultants all come together to think big thoughts and solve the world's problems. There's actually more of those that go on each and every year than many of us understand. So that's the absolute latest thing I'm doing as of yesterday, working on global policy summits and trying to figure them out.
Yeah, and that's interesting from a global governance perspective, of course.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and you have your new textbook is finally coming out now in 2020. The new edition of Beyond Policy Analysis.
Beyond Policy Analysis.
Yes.
Policy Management in Turbulent Times. So the 6th edition, co-authored with Graham Auld and Alexander Mallet, 2 colleagues of mine at Carleton. It's available. It's mostly online right now, but I think available also in hard copy through Amazon if people care to look for it. But the edition went to the publisher obviously before the pandemic, so I think people are going to have to go back to the drawing board in some respects when they're redesigning their next editions of their policy analysis textbooks to try to take into account everything that happened with the pandemic. But I'm still proud of it. I think we were as up to date as one could possibly be in 2020. So it came out this year.
Great. And one last thing I would like to ask you. I would like to take a more futuristic approach. And I know also that you have another book in the making on the future of the policy sciences.
Yes, that's right.
I would like to conclude a bit with, I want to pick your mind on this topic. What do you think is the future of policy sciences, of comparative policy analysis, to go back into our journal's interests?
Well, let me say 2 things, and we'll probably close there. One is, and this has been part of the journal mission, to try to expand the geographical scope of our comparative analysis. As you know, certainly 10 years ago, and certainly 20 years ago, the epicenter of our analytical framework tended to be Western Europe, North America, kind of the OECD countries. And Iris and I and the editorial team have tried to expand that geographical scope. So we've, I think, succeeded in that. That's another kind of change that's occurred, is we're getting more and more articles from, less from Africa than I would like, less from this region, MENA, Middle East and North Africa, but more from Asia. So we're doing better in the Asian scope. So I think one future direction, one future challenge, one future opportunity for our discipline and our field is to get serious about doing better comparative analysis across systems, across North American, OECD, and Asian systems. I mean, and that's very broad, but we need to think about China. You know, we need to think about Indonesia. We need to think about authoritarian or quasi-authoritarian or competitive authoritarian regimes. The world is, the trend lines for liberal democracies are not going up. So, you know, we need to start thinking about different types of policy systems that don't necessarily approximate Denmark.
Yeah.
So that's one area, and in terms of the future. The other big question for me, and this came up in the book in the conclusion, and we wrestled with it in the conclusion, is the role of the state in the next decade. And you know, one could look at the pandemic and look at the extraordinary expansion of state surveillance and state capacity. Well, capacity in some cases, but let's say surveillance and state ambition and state authority in terms of things like lockdowns. I mean, anybody watching this, who would have imagined on December the 18th of 2020 that entire populations of countries could have been told to stay home and not to see anybody else, or not to go out on the street, or not walk their dog, and that if you did, you could be tracked and traced and surveyed. So on the one hand, the role of the state would eclipse almost anything Orwell could have dreamt of in his worst dreams and nightmares. On the other hand, maybe in 6 months, we're just going to go back to normal, and that wave will have receded, and we don't need to worry about this kind of expansion of state authority. I'm a little bit more skeptical of that latter. I think innovations and expansions of power like this are sticky, and they're sweet. They're sticky because bureaucracies have a hard time going back to ratcheting back, and they're sweet because politicians like power. So it's a worrisome development, but it's something I think our discipline has to pay attention to.
All right. Thank you, Leslie. Thank you for the time to give this interview to me. I would like to extend our gratitude on behalf of the whole team at the JCPA, Iris, and everybody. It's been a pleasure working with you. I wish you good luck in your new adventures. We will meet again, of course. Yes. And yeah, thank you very much for this interview, and good luck.
Thank you very much. A pleasure.